The champagne glass shattered against marble as Victoria Winters, CEO of a billion-dollar empire, made the most reckless decision of her perfectly controlled life. Tonight, she would walk into that restaurant and tell James Parker, the struggling single father who photographed her annual report 6 months ago, exactly what she wanted. No corporate politeness, no calculated strategy. Just 5 words that would change everything. I have waited long enough. At 42, Victoria had crushed competitors and built an empire that made powerful men tremble. But James, this widowed photographer raising his sick daughter alone, had cracked something inside her she thought she buried 15 years ago. She wanted him. She wanted his daughter. She wanted the family she sacrificed for power. What Victoria did not know was that her board was plotting her destruction at that exact moment, and James was hiding a devastating secret about his daughter's condition that could destroy everything before it began. Hit that like button and tell me where you are watching from, because what happens next will redefine everything you thought you knew about love, power, and the courage to choose what truly matters. But to understand why Victoria Winters was willing to risk everything tonight, you need to understand the woman she used to be. The woman she killed 20 years ago to survive. Victoria did not start as ice. She started as fire. 22 years old, standing in a cramped apartment in Brooklyn that smelled like instant ramen and ambition. Victoria Chen. Back then, she still used her father's name, was everything the current Victoria Winters was not. Messy ponytail, thrift store jeans, eyes that sparkled with naive belief that good ideas and hard work were enough to change the world. She had just dropped out of Columbia's engineering program to launch her first startup with her boyfriend and business partner Marcus Chen. They were going to revolutionize cloud storage security. They were going to be the next big thing. They were going to build an empire together. Marcus proposed on the night they signed their first major client contract. Down on one knee in their tiny office space, a ring he definitely could not afford glinting under fluorescent lights. Victoria said yes without hesitation, because she believed in fairy tales back then. She believed that love and ambition could coexist. She believed that the man who whispered dreams into her ear at 3 in the morning while they coded side by side would never become the nightmare that destroyed her. She was wrong about everything. The betrayal came 6 months later, 3 weeks before their wedding. Victoria arrived at their office early one Tuesday morning to find Marcus already there, which was unusual. He was always the late sleeper, the creative genius who worked best after midnight. She almost turned around to grab them both coffee when she noticed the open laptop on his desk screen illuminating his face with that particular glow she knew meant he was deep in their proprietary code. Except he was not debugging, he was copying. Victoria stood in the doorway, watching the man she loved systematically transfer 18 months of her work, her innovations, her sleepless nights onto an external hard drive. The security protocol she had designed specifically to prevent data theft, the one Marcus had insisted they did not need to implement internally because they trusted each other, that protocol would have caught this. But love makes you stupid. Trust makes you vulnerable. She must have made a sound because Marcus looked up. Their eyes met. And in that split second before he started explaining, before the lies began tumbling out, Victoria saw the truth in his face. This was not a moment of weakness. This was calculated. This was planned. This had been the plan all along. The hard drive was already sold. The buyer was Techdyne Solutions. Their biggest competitor, the company that had rejected Victoria's initial pitch 2 years earlier, because she was too young, too female, too ethnic to be taken seriously. Marcus had been negotiating with them for 4 months. The wedding was meant to happen right before the deal closed, ensuring Victoria would be legally tied to him, making it harder for her to pursue action when she inevitably discovered the theft. He had weaponized her love. He had turned her dreams into his payday. What Victoria remembered most about that morning was not the screaming or the crying that came after. It was the silence. That terrible moment of clarity when she realized every late night, every shared dream, every whispered promise had been a transaction to him. She was never his partner. She was his mark. Tech9 launched her security protocol under their brand 6 weeks later. Marcus became their VP of Innovation with a salary that made Victoria physically sick when she saw it reported in TechCrunch. Her startup collapsed within days. Investors pulled out. Her reputation was shredded by rumors Marcus strategically planted about her technical incompetence and emotional instability. The girl who was going to change the world could not even pay her rent. Victoria moved back into her childhood bedroom in Queens, 22 years old and destroyed. Her mother, who had emigrated from Taiwan and worked 3 jobs to send Victoria to Colombia, made her congee every morning and said nothing. Sometimes silence is the kindest response to devastation. For 3 months, Victoria barely left that room. She would lie on her twin bed, staring at the ceiling where she had stuck glow in the dark stars as a child, and wonder if Marcus had ever loved her, even a little. The not knowing was worse than the betrayal. At least betrayal was definitive. But the question of whether any of it was real, that question had teeth. The turning point came on a random Wednesday afternoon. Victoria was walking to the corner store when she passed a newsstand and saw Marcus's face on the cover of a business magazine. The headline called him a visionary. They quoted him talking about his innovative security protocols using the exact words Victoria had used when she first pitched the idea to him 2 years earlier. He had stolen her voice along with her code. Standing there on a Queens sidewalk, something inside Victoria calcified. The grief transformed into something harder, colder, infinitely more dangerous. She was done being the victim. Done crying over a man who had turned her heart into profit margin. If the world rewarded people like Marcus, then she would learn to play by those rules. She would become what she needed to become to never be vulnerable again. The next morning, Victoria walked into a temp agency and took the first corporate job they offered. Executive assistant at a mid-tier consulting firm. The pay was terrible. The work was mind-numbing, but it got her in the door. She started attending night classes for her MBA, paying for it with maxed-out credit cards and sheer determination. During lunch breaks, she studied the executives she assisted. How they talked, how they moved, how they wielded power like a scalpel. She learned that sentiment was liability. She learned that trust was for people who could afford to lose. She learned that the only person you could rely on was yourself. Within 2 years, Victoria had her MBA and a junior analyst position at a venture capital firm. She worked 100-hour weeks volunteering for every impossible project, every thankless task. She became known as the woman who never said no, never complained, never showed weakness. Behind closed doors, male colleagues called her the Ice Queen. She wore it like armor. Her first major power move came 3 years into her VC career. The firm was evaluating a startup pitch from a young female founder with revolutionary AI technology. Victoria recognized the same fire she once had in the founder's eyes, that dangerous combination of brilliance and naivete. The senior partners were planning to lowball the valuation, install their own CEO, and effectively steal the company from its creator. Old Victoria would have been horrified. New Victoria saw an opportunity. She went to the founder privately and laid out exactly what the firm was planning. Then she made an offer. Victoria would secure fair funding and protect the founder's control, but in exchange, Victoria wanted a seat on the board and equity points that would make her rich when the company went public. The founder, grateful and desperate, agreed. Victoria structured the deal to protect the founder while simultaneously positioning herself as the emerging power player at the firm. When the company went public, 18 months later, Victoria's shares were worth $42 million. She was 29 years old. She used that money to start her own venture capital firm, with one stated mission: identify innovative tech startups and acquire them before they reach their full potential. Within 5 years, Victoria Winters, she had legally changed her name, shedding the last vestige of the girl who believed in Marcus Chen, had built a reputation as the most ruthless investor in Silicon Valley. Companies celebrated when she showed interest. They should have been terrified. Her strategy was elegant in its cruelty. Invest early. Gain board control. Replace founders with experienced executives. Scale rapidly. Sell at massive profit. Repeat. She became everything she once despised because it worked. Because vulnerability was for people who could afford to bleed. The corporate bodies piled up behind her. Founders who trusted her found themselves ousted from companies they built. Employees who believed her promises about culture and mission learned that quarterly earnings mattered more. Victoria told herself she was teaching them the same lesson Marcus taught her. The world does not reward the sincere. It rewards the strategic. By 35, Victoria had liquidated her VC portfolio and used the proceeds to acquire a struggling enterprise software company called Horizon Tech. She rebranded it as Horizon Enterprises, fired 70% of the staff, and rebuilt it according to her vision. No sentiment. No loyalty beyond contractual obligation. No room for the weakness that destroyed her at 22. Horizon grew into a billion-dollar empire under her leadership. The business press wrote glowing profiles about her as a feminist icon, a self-made success story living proof that women could compete in the ruthless world of corporate America. They had no idea they were celebrating a woman who had systematically murdered every soft part of herself to survive. Victoria's personal life reflected her philosophy. Brief relationships with appropriate men that never progressed beyond surface-level companionship. No talk of marriage. No sharing of vulnerabilities. No risk of anyone getting close enough to matter. She attended charity galas with handsome dates who understood they were accessories, not partners. She perfected the art of intimacy without connection. Her mother asked once, when Victoria was visiting for Lunar New Year, whether she was happy. Victoria had deflected with talk of quarterly earnings and expansion plans. Her mother listened, then said something in Mandarin that translated roughly to "You can build towers to heaven and still die alone in the cold." Victoria left early that year. Happiness was for people who could afford the luxury of vulnerability. Victoria built fortresses instead. By the time she turned 40, Victoria could not remember the last time she had cried. Could not remember the last time she had let anyone see beneath the immaculate surface she presented to the world. The woman who once believed in fairy tales had been replaced by a creature who believed in contracts leverage and the cold comfort of a bank account that could never betray you. She told herself she had won. Marcus Chen had gotten his moment of glory, but where was he now? Still a VP at Techdyne, while Victoria commanded an empire. She had transformed her destruction into domination. That was victory, was it not? Except some nights alone in her penthouse with city lights glittering below like earthbound stars, Victoria would pour herself expensive scotch and wonder what happened to the girl who used to stick glow in the dark stars on her ceiling. The girl who believed love and ambition could coexist. The girl who trusted that good people building good things would be enough. She told herself that girl was weak. That girl would never have survived. That girl had to die so Victoria Winters could be born. But you cannot kill parts of yourself without consequences. You cannot build walls high enough to keep out pain without also keeping out everything else. Victoria did not realize how completely she had isolated herself until 18 months ago on a random Saturday afternoon. She was walking through Central Park taking a rare break from work when she saw a father playing with his young daughter near the fountain. The girl could not have been more than 5 pigtails bouncing as she ran toward the water. The father chased after her laughing, scooping her up just before she could tumble in. The child shrieked with joy, wrapping small arms around his neck. Victoria stopped walking. Actually, stopped in the middle of the path and stared at them like she had never seen a parent and child before. The father was not checking his phone, was not distracted by work emails. His entire world in that moment was the laughing child in his arms. His face reflected pure, uncomplicated love. The kind of love that asks for nothing except the chance to give. Something cracked inside Victoria's chest. Actually cracked like ice breaking under pressure. For the first time in 15 years, she felt tears sliding down her face in public. She had built an empire, but would never know what it felt like to have a child run to her with that kind of trust. She had conquered boardrooms, but would never experience love that was not transactional. She had protected herself so completely that she had become unreachable. Standing there in Central Park Mascara, probably running designer suit, suddenly feeling like a costume Victoria Winters realized she had made a terrible mistake. Not in building her career, not in demanding respect in a world designed to diminish her, but in believing that power and connection were mutually exclusive. In thinking that protecting yourself meant destroying the parts of you capable of loving without calculation. She had become so good at winning that she forgot what she was supposed to be winning for. Victoria walked home that day and sat in her empty penthouse for hours, really looking at the life she had built. Expensive furniture no one sat on. A kitchen that never saw home-cooked meals. Bedrooms that guests never occupied because she never let anyone stay long enough to need them. She had everything and nothing simultaneously. That was the day Victoria decided she wanted more. Not more money or power or market share. More life. More connection. More of whatever that father and daughter had that made them laugh like the world was not waiting to destroy them. She had no idea how to get there. You cannot simply decide to become vulnerable again after spending 15 years building impenetrable defenses. You cannot flip a switch and suddenly trust people after learning that trust is how you get destroyed. But Victoria was nothing if not strategic. If she could build $1 billion company, surely she could figure out how to build a life worth living. She started small. Learned to say yes to dinner invitations from colleagues instead of always declining. Attended her assistant's wedding instead of sending a gift with an excuse. Visited her mother more regularly and actually listened instead of mentally reviewing quarterly projections during the conversation. The changes were glacial, incremental, but they were changes. The Ice Queen began to thaw at the edges, though she was careful not to let anyone see too much melting too fast. Control was still her comfort zone. And then James Parker walked into her office 6 months ago to photograph Horizon's annual report, and every careful strategy Victoria had developed fell apart within the first 10 minutes of meeting him. James Parker was not supposed to be the man who cracked Victoria Winters open. He was supposed to be a vendor, a photographer hired for a corporate gig, paid and forgotten. But the universe has a way of destroying the best-laid plans of people who think they have everything figured out. To understand why James mattered, why this struggling single father with calloused hands and a camera bag held together with duct tape could shake the foundations of a woman who had withstood hostile takeovers, you need to understand what grief had taught him about the difference between surviving and living. 6 years earlier, James Parker was a different man entirely. He worked in marketing for a mid-sized advertising firm, wore suits that fit properly, and had a 401k he actually contributed to regularly. He lived in a comfortable 2-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn with his wife Sarah and their 3-year-old daughter Emma. Life was not extraordinary, but it was good. It was stable. It was enough. Sarah had been his college sweetheart. They met in a photography elective class junior year, when James was supposed to be focusing on his marketing degree but kept sneaking off to the darkroom to develop film. Sarah was an elementary school teacher with paint perpetually under her fingernails and a laugh that made everyone around her want to laugh too. She saw the artist James was pretending not to be and loved him for it anyway. Their marriage was the kind that made other couples slightly envious. Easy affection. Inside jokes that spanned years. The ability to communicate entire conversations with a single look across a crowded room. When Emma was born, Sarah quit teaching to stay home, and James took on extra freelance work to cover the income gap. It was tight financially, but they were happy. Genuinely, uncomplicatedly happy. The cancer diagnosis came on a Tuesday afternoon in October. Sarah had been complaining about fatigue for months, blaming it on chasing a toddler and poor sleep. When she finally went to the doctor, they found stage 3 ovarian cancer that had already metastasized. The oncologist gave them treatment options and statistics that might as well have been a death sentence wrapped in medical terminology. Sarah fought for 3 years. Chemotherapy that left her so weak she could barely hold Emma. Radiation that burned her skin and stole her beautiful hair. Experimental treatments that cost them their savings and did nothing except buy a few more months. James watched the woman who used to dance in the kitchen while making breakfast waste away into someone he barely recognized. He photographed her through it all. Started as a way to document Emma's childhood in case Sarah did not make it to see her grow up, but evolved into something else. A way to see his wife as she truly was, instead of as the disease consuming her. Through his lens, Sarah was still radiant. Still laughing, even when the laugh turned into a cough. Still beautiful, even when conventional beauty had been stripped away by medical intervention. The night she died, Sarah was in their bedroom because she refused to die in a hospital. Hospice had set up equipment that made their space look clinical, but James had surrounded her with photographs he had taken over the years. Sarah at their wedding. Sarah pregnant with Emma. Sarah and Emma finger painting on the kitchen floor. A life in images because images were all he knew how to give her by then. Emma was asleep in her room. Sarah had insisted she not be woken up, not wanting their daughter's last memory to be watching her mother die. So it was just James holding Sarah's hand as her breathing became more and more labored, the hospice nurse in the corner giving them privacy while monitoring machines that would soon go silent. Sarah opened her eyes one last time around 3 in the morning, looked directly at James with a clarity that had been absent for weeks. Her voice was barely a whisper when she said, "Take care of our girl." Then softer, almost like she was asking permission, "Let yourself be happy again someday." Her last breath came 5 minutes later. The hospice nurse checked for a pulse, noted the time, and began making the necessary calls. James sat there holding his wife's hand long after it went cold, wondering how you are supposed to keep living when half of yourself just stopped. The funeral was surreal. Everyone telling him how sorry they were, how strong he was being, how Sarah was in a better place now. James nodded and accepted casseroles he would never eat, and listened to people who meant well say things that did not help. Emma clung to his leg the entire time, asking when Mommy was coming back. No one had adequately explained death to a 6-year-old in a way that made sense. 2 weeks after burying his wife, James had to photograph a wedding. He had booked it months earlier when they still needed the money for Sarah's treatments, and canceling meant losing the deposit he could not afford to lose. So, he showed up at a venue decorated in white roses and fairy lights, watching a young couple promise forever to each other, and tried not to think about how forever was a lie people told themselves to feel safe. He made it through the ceremony, through the reception, through the first dance and the cake cutting and all the rituals of celebrating a beginning when all James could think about was endings. He captured beautiful images of 2 people who believed they were invincible because they had not learned yet that love cannot protect you from loss. In his car afterward, James broke down completely, sobbing so hard he could not breathe, hands shaking too badly to start the engine. He had just spent 8 hours documenting joy. He no longer believed in pretending to be functional when everything inside him was shattered. The money from that wedding paid for 1 month of Emma's therapy sessions with a child psychologist who specialized in grief. James had no idea if they were helping. Emma stopped asking when Mommy was coming back, but she also stopped talking much at all. She would sit for hours holding Sarah's favorite cardigan, not crying, just holding it like a talisman against a world that had proven itself capable of taking away the people you loved most. James quit his marketing job 6 months after Sarah died. Partly because he could not focus enough to be effective, partly because the corporate world felt absurd when measured against real loss, mostly because he needed flexibility to be present for Emma in a way a 9-to-5 would never allow. He took his severance package and his 401k early withdrawal penalties and bet everything on building a photography business. People told him he was crazy, that grief was making him reckless, that he had a daughter to think about and stability mattered more than following some artistic dream. James listened to all of it and did it anyway because Sarah's last words kept echoing in his head. Let yourself be happy again someday. He could not be happy, not yet, maybe not ever. But he could build something that felt less like slowly dying. The photography business grew slowly. Portraits mostly. Families who wanted images that felt real instead of posed. James had a gift for capturing genuine moments, probably because he understood how precious and temporary those moments were. He was not getting rich, but he was paying bills. More importantly, he was present for Emma, taking her to school, picking her up, making dinner even when it was just chicken nuggets and apple slices. Being there. Emma started talking again, started smiling, started bringing home drawings from school that she would stick on their refrigerator with magnets. The psychologist said she was making remarkable progress. James tried to believe that progress was the same as healing. They built a new normal together, a life that was smaller and sadder than before, but was still a life. James taught Emma how to use a camera, and she started documenting the world through her own lens. Mostly close-ups of flowers and pigeons, but occasionally she would capture something that took James's breath away with its unintentional insight. For 5 years, they existed in this careful equilibrium. Not thriving exactly, but surviving. James dated occasionally awkward dinners with women who did not understand why he still wore his wedding ring on a chain around his neck. Emma made friends at school and had sleepovers where she seemed almost like a regular kid who had not learned too young that people leave and do not come back. Then came Emma's kindergarten graduation 18 months ago, and the equilibrium shattered. The ceremony was held in the school gym, decorated with construction paper mortarboards and streamers. Emma was wearing the white dress James had bought specifically for the occasion, her hair in pigtails beaming as she walked across the makeshift stage to receive her certificate. James was filming on his phone, proud and sad simultaneously because Sarah should have been there to see this. Emma reached the principal, shook hands like they had practiced, and turned to wave at James in the audience. Then her smile faltered. Her hand went to her chest, and she collapsed. The next minutes were chaos James could barely remember afterward. Him running to the stage, teachers surrounding Emma, someone calling 911, Emma conscious but confused, her skin pale and clammy, saying her chest hurt and she could not catch her breath. The ambulance ride where James held her hand and promised everything would be okay, while internally screaming at the universe that it had already taken Sarah and could not possibly be cruel enough to take Emma too. The emergency room doctors ran tests: EKG, echocardiogram, blood work, chest x-rays. They admitted Emma overnight for observation while they waited for a pediatric cardiologist to review the results. James sat in a plastic chair beside her hospital bed watching monitors track her heartbeat and felt the same helpless terror he had felt watching Sarah deteriorate. The diagnosis came the next morning. Restrictive cardiomyopathy, a rare condition where the heart muscle becomes stiff and cannot relax properly between beats. In children, it was especially dangerous, progressive, no cure. Treatment focused on managing symptoms and preventing sudden cardiac death while hoping for a transplant that might never come. The cardiologist, a kind woman in her 50s who had clearly delivered terrible news too many times, explained it all in language James was supposed to understand. Medications to help the heart work more efficiently, regular monitoring, lifestyle restrictions, the possibility that Emma's condition could remain stable for years or could deteriorate rapidly. They simply could not predict. James listened and nodded and asked the appropriate questions while internally drowning. The cost of the medications alone would strain his budget. The specialist appointments. The potential for hospitalization. The monitoring equipment. He had basic health insurance through the freelancer marketplace, but the co-pays and deductibles were going to bury him. More terrifying than the financial burden was the knowledge that he could lose her. That this daughter he had fought so hard to keep whole after Sarah's death could be taken from him by another disease he was powerless to stop. The universe had proven it did not care about fair. It had proven it would take everything if you let it. Emma was released from the hospital 3 days later with a pharmacy bag full of medications and instructions to avoid strenuous activity. She was 9 years old and could not run on the playground anymore. Could not take dance classes like she wanted. Had to sit out of gym class while other kids played. The injustice of it made James want to break things. He did not break things. He adapted. That was what you did when the alternative was falling apart. He restructured his photography schedule around Emma's medical appointments. He learned to give cardiac medications and monitor her symptoms. He became an expert on restrictive cardiomyopathy, joining online support groups for parents of children with rare heart conditions, reading medical journals he barely understood. The medical bills started piling up within months. Even with insurance, the out-of-pocket costs were astronomical. James took on more photography work editing late into the night after Emma went to sleep, accepting jobs he would have previously turned down. He sold his car and bought a cheaper used one. He moved them to a smaller apartment to save on rent. He cut every expense he could identify. It was not enough. 18 months after Emma's diagnosis, James was drowning in medical debt and facing the reality that he might not be able to afford her care. The medications alone cost nearly $1,000 a month after insurance. The specialist visits, the quarterly echocardiograms, the emergency room trips. When Emma had episodes, it all added up to more than his photography business could sustain. He looked into financial assistance programs, applied for medical grants, started a GoFundMe that raised a few $1,000s from sympathetic strangers, but nowhere near enough. He considered going back to corporate work, but could not figure out how to manage Emma's medical needs with the inflexibility of a traditional job. Then Emma's private school, the one with the small class sizes and understanding teachers who knew about her condition, delivered the ultimatum. The tuition increase for the next year, combined with his outstanding balance, meant he owed $12,000. Pay by the end of the month or withdraw Emma and find another school. James had no idea where he was going to find $12,000. He had already maxed out his credit cards on medical expenses, had already borrowed from the few friends who could afford to lend, had already sold everything of value except his camera equipment because that was his livelihood. He was sitting at his kitchen table at 2 a.m, staring at bills he could not pay when his phone buzzed with an email. A corporate photography gig. Horizon Enterprises needed someone to photograph their annual report. The budget was generous. Not $12,000 generous, but enough to make a dent. James accepted the job without researching the company. He needed the money too badly to be selective. That decision changed everything. 6 months ago, James walked into Horizon Enterprises headquarters carrying his camera bag and trying to look more professional than he felt. The building was all glass and steel and money, the kind of place that made him acutely aware he was wearing a suit he had owned since before Sarah died, and shoes that should have been replaced 2 years ago. The receptionist directed him to the executive floor, where he would be photographing the leadership team. James set up his equipment in a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, checked his lighting, and tried to remember how to do corporate photography. He was used to candid family portraits and event coverage. Posed executive headshots required a different energy. The first few subjects were forgettable. CFO, who wanted to look powerful. COO, who was clearly uncomfortable in front of the camera. VP of whatever, who kept checking his phone between shots. James guided them through poses, made small talk to relax them, captured the images they needed. Then, Victoria Winters walked into the conference room and James forgot how to breathe properly. She was not conventionally warm. That was James's first thought. Everything about her screamed controlled perfection. Platinum blonde hair styled in a way that probably cost more than his rent. A black suit that fit like it was tailored specifically for her body because it definitely was. Heels that added 3 inches to her height and doubled as weapons. The kind of beauty that was constructed rather than natural, but no less striking for it. But what caught James's attention was not her appearance. It was the way she held herself. Like she was braced for attack from every direction. Like vulnerability was a disease she had been vaccinated against. Her eyes, pale blue, and assessing scanned the room, and dismissed him as irrelevant within 2 seconds. "Hello," she said, her voice crisp and professional. "You must be the photographer. I have 15 minutes. James had dealt with difficult subjects before. Corporate executives who thought their time was too valuable to waste on photos they claimed not to care about, but would definitely complain about if they looked bad. He knew how to handle this. "James Parker," he introduced himself, gesturing to the chair he had set up. "If you could sit here, we will work quickly." Victoria sat with the posture of someone who had attended deportment classes. Straight back, chin slightly elevated, hands folded in her lap with precision. She looked like a stock photo of a CEO. Powerful, competent, completely devoid of humanity. James looked through his camera lens and frowned. This was not going to work. "Could you relax your shoulders a bit?" he suggested. "You look like you are preparing for battle." "I am always preparing for battle," Victoria replied without missing a beat. "That is how I survive." The comment was delivered matter-of-factly, but something in her tone made James look up from his camera. For just a second, he saw past the armor to something raw underneath. Exhaustion, maybe. Or loneliness disguised as strength. "You do not have to survive me," James said gently. "I am just here to take your picture." Victoria's expression flickered with something he could not quite identify. Surprise, maybe, at being challenged, however mildly. She adjusted her posture, slightly softening in ways so subtle most people would not have noticed. But James noticed everything. That was his job. "Better," he said, raising the camera again. "Now think about something that makes you genuinely happy. Not successful, happy." "I do not understand the distinction," Victoria said, but there was a hint of humor in her voice now. "Success is what you show the world," James explained, taking a few shots. "Happiness is what you feel when no one is looking. They are not always the same thing." Victoria was quiet for a moment, actually considering his words instead of dismissing them. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. "That is surprisingly philosophical for a corporate photographer." "I'm not usually a corporate photographer," James admitted. "I do mostly family portraits. This is outside my comfort zone." "Mine too," Victoria said, and there was something almost vulnerable in the admission. They spent the next 10 minutes in conversation that had nothing to do with photography. Victoria asked about his regular work. James told her about capturing real moments instead of posed perfection. She asked if he believed those real moments were more valuable than cultivated image. He said he thought authenticity was always more valuable than performance, even if it was less immediately impressive. Victoria listened in a way that suggested she was actually hearing him instead of just waiting for her turn to talk. When James finally lowered his camera and said he had everything he needed, she looked almost disappointed. "Thank you," she said, standing and smoothing her suit. "That was less painful than I expected." "High praise," James replied with a grin. Victoria moved toward the door, then paused. "Your family portraits. Do you have a portfolio I could look at?" James blinked, surprised. "Sure. My website is on the card I gave your assistant. But can I ask why you do not seem like the family portrait type?" "I'm not," Victoria agreed. "But I am curious about your perspective on authenticity versus performance. You clearly have strong opinions." She left before James could respond, her heels clicking against the polished floor as she disappeared down the hallway. He stood there in the conference room wondering what had just happened. That had not felt like a typical client interaction. That had felt like something else entirely. 3 days later, Victoria's assistant emailed requesting a meeting. Not about the photographs which had been approved without changes, about a potential project. Could James come to Horizon Enterprises to discuss details? James showed up to the meeting expecting a corporate gig. Maybe they wanted event coverage or additional headshots. What he got instead was Victoria Winters sitting in her massive office overlooking Manhattan, offering him something completely unexpected. "I have been reviewing your portfolio," she said without preamble. "Your work is exceptional. You capture people as they actually are, instead of as they wish to be perceived. That is rare." "Thank you," James said carefully, unsure where this was going. "I am restructuring Horizon's marketing approach," Victoria continued. "Moving away from sterile corporate imagery toward something more human. I want to hire you to develop a campaign that shows our employees and leadership as real people. Can you do that?" The budget she quoted made James's eyes widen. It was more than he made in 3 months of regular work. It would cover Emma's school tuition and make a significant dent in their medical debt. "I can do that," he agreed immediately. What James did not say was that he needed this job desperately. That his daughter's health and education depended on income he could not reliably generate. That he was one emergency away from financial collapse. Victoria did not need to know his desperation. This was business, except it did not stay business. The project required regular meetings to discuss concepts and review work. James would come to Horizon's offices usually in the evening after Emma was settled with her babysitter, and he and Victoria would work through ideas in her conference room. She was brilliant in ways he had not expected. Not just strategically smart, but creatively insightful. She understood branding and image construction at a level that made James's marketing degree feel inadequate. But more than her intelligence, James found himself drawn to the moments when her guard dropped. Usually late at night when they had been working for hours and exhaustion made pretense too difficult to maintain. She would make observations that were surprisingly vulnerable. Would ask questions that revealed how isolated she actually was. Would look at his photographs of families and something wistful would cross her face before she locked it away again. One night, about 6 weeks into the project, Emma had a medical episode that required an emergency room visit. James had to cancel their meeting at the last minute, texting Victoria a brief apology without details. He spent 5 hours in the pediatric ER while doctors stabilized Emma's heart rhythm, his phone dying because he forgot to charge it in his panic. When he finally got Emma home and settled at 4 in the morning, he found 17 missed calls from Victoria and a text that simply said, "Are you all right?" He called her back even though it was an unreasonable hour because something about her concern felt genuine in a way that demanded acknowledgement. She answered on the first ring, her voice sharp with worry. "What happened?" she demanded. James found himself telling her everything. Emma's heart condition, the ER visit, his terror every time something went wrong. He had not meant to dump all of this on a client, but exhaustion and fear made him honest in ways he normally was not. Victoria was quiet for a long moment after he finished. Then she said something that surprised him. "I am coming over." "You do not have to do that," James protested. "It is 4 in the morning. I am fine." "No, you are not," Victoria replied, "and you should not be alone right now. What is your address?" She showed up 40 minutes later, wearing jeans and a sweater, looking more human than James had ever seen her. No makeup, hair in a ponytail, like she had just grabbed whatever was closest and left. She was carrying a bag from a 24-hour diner. "You need to eat," she said, handing him the bag. "And I need you to tell me about Emma's condition. All of it. The diagnosis, the prognosis, the treatment plan, the costs, everything." They sat at James's small kitchen table as the sun started rising over Brooklyn, and he told her things he had not told anyone. How scared he was, how inadequate he felt, how he had no idea if he was making the right medical decisions or ruining his daughter's chances. How the financial burden was crushing him, but he would figure it out because that was what parents did. Victoria listened without interrupting. When he finally stopped talking, she asked detailed questions that proved she had been paying close attention. Then she made an offer that should have felt patronizing but somehow did not. Horizon has a medical assistance program for employees and contractors, she said carefully. It is designed to help with situations exactly like yours. Would you let me connect you with those resources? James wanted to say no, wanted to maintain his pride and handle his problems himself, but he was too tired and too scared to refuse help he desperately needed. Over the following weeks, Victoria helped him navigate insurance complexities and connected him with specialists in pediatric cardiology who were leaders in restrictive cardiomyopathy treatment. She never made it feel like charity, always framed it as him doing her a favor by giving feedback on Horizon's support programs. But the help was not one-sided. James started bringing Emma to occasional meetings when childcare fell through, and he watched Victoria transform around his daughter. The Ice Queen melted into someone warm and genuinely interested in a 9-year-old's opinions about everything from photography to her favorite books. Emma adored Victoria immediately, in that uncomplicated way children love people who actually see them. And Victoria, who claimed to have no maternal instincts, would sit on the floor of the conference room helping Emma edit photos on a tablet, speaking to her with a respect and patience that revealed something tender beneath all that armor. James fell in love slowly, and then all at once. Somewhere between watching Victoria laugh at one of Emma's terrible jokes and seeing her cry when Emma gave her a drawing as a thank you gift. Somewhere between late-night conversations about loss and loneliness and quiet moments when they both realized they were not alone anymore. But he did not say anything, could not say anything. Victoria was his client, and so far out of his league they might as well exist on different planets. She was a billionaire CEO. He was a struggling photographer who could not afford his daughter's medication. Whatever he felt, it was not something he could act on. Then, 3 weeks ago, Emma asked the question that made pretending impossible. James had picked her up from a playdate at Victoria's penthouse. Yes, Victoria somehow had Emma over for playdates now, and Emma was unusually quiet on the subway ride home. Finally, she looked up at James with those serious eyes that were too old for a 9-year-old and asked, "Daddy, is Victoria going to be my new mom?" James had no idea how to answer that. He settled for, "Why do you ask, sweetie?" "Because she looks at us the way Mommy used to look at us in the old pictures," Emma explained. "Like we are her favorite thing in the whole world, and you look at her the same way. So I thought maybe she would be my new mom." The simplicity of childhood logic breaking through adult complications. James tried to explain that things were not that simple, that Victoria was their friend, that family did not work that way. But Emma just shrugged and said, "I hope she does become my mom because I really like her." That conversation haunted James for weeks, because Emma was right. He did look at Victoria like she was his favorite thing. And Victoria looked at both of them with something that felt remarkably like love, even if neither of them had named it yet. 2 days ago, Victoria had invited him to dinner. Just the two of them. Not a business meeting. A date, though neither used that word. James accepted, knowing that everything was about to change, terrified and hopeful in equal measure. Which brought him to tonight standing in front of his mirror adjusting his tie for the 3rd time, about to walk into a restaurant and find out if the woman who taught him it was possible to want something beyond mere survival wanted him too. The phone call that shattered everything came at 2:17 in the morning on a Tuesday, 3 days before the dinner that would change their lives. James jolted awake to his phone vibrating violently on the nightstand, his heart already racing with the particular dread that comes from middle-of-the-night calls when you have a sick child. The babysitter's name glowed on the screen. He answered before the second ring. "Emma's having trouble breathing." Melissa's voice was tight with barely controlled panic. "She says her chest feels tight and she's really pale. I think we need to go to the hospital." James was out of bed before she finished the sentence, pulling on jeans with one hand while keeping the phone pressed to his ear. "Call 911. I will be there in 5 minutes." He lived 6 blocks away from the small apartment where Melissa watched Emma on the rare nights James had evening commitments. He ran the entire distance, his breath coming in gasps that had nothing to do with exertion and everything to do with terror. This was not the first emergency with Emma's heart, but each one carried the possibility of being the last. The ambulance was already there when James arrived, lights painting the quiet residential street in urgent reds and blues. He found Emma on a gurney in the living room, oxygen mask over her small face, paramedics working with practiced efficiency while Melissa hovered nearby crying. Daddy Emma's voice was muffled behind the mask, but he could hear the fear in it. "My heart feels funny." James took her hand, squeezing gently while forcing his voice to stay calm. "I know, baby. These nice people are going to help you feel better. Okay, I am right here." The ride to New York Presbyterian's Pediatric Emergency Department was a blur of medical terminology James had learned to understand over the past 18 months. Tachycardia, arrhythmia, decreased oxygen saturation. The paramedics radioed ahead and James held Emma's hand while silently bargaining with any deity that might be listening. Take anything else. Take his business. Take his apartment. Take years off his own life. Just not her. Please, not her. The emergency room erupted into controlled chaos when they arrived. Nurses and doctors converging, moving Emma to a bed, attaching monitors that beeped with alarming urgency. Someone was asking James questions about her medications and medical history, while someone else was starting an IV, and Emma was crying now, scared and in pain, reaching for him. "Sir, you need to step back," a nurse said firmly but not unkindly, physically moving James away from the bed so the medical team could work. He stood there useless and terrified while they stabilized his daughter, watching monitors he did not fully understand. Display numbers he knew were not good. The attending physician, a woman who looked too young to have the kind of authority she wielded, was barking orders about medications and tests, her face set in an expression that made James's stomach drop. After what felt like hours, but was probably 20 minutes, the immediate crisis was controlled. Emma's heart rate was still elevated, but no longer dangerously so. Her oxygen levels were improving. The doctor approached James with an expression that healthcare professionals reserve for delivering news that is going to hurt. "Mr. Parker, I am Dr. Chen. Emma is stable for now, but her condition has deteriorated significantly. The restrictive cardiomyopathy is progressing faster than we hoped. We need to admit her and run a full cardiac workup." "What does that mean?" James asked, though he already knew. He had read enough medical journals in the past year to understand exactly what faster progression implied. "It means her heart is not compensating as well as it was," Dr. Chen explained gently. "The medications are becoming less effective. We need to evaluate whether she needs to be listed for a transplant sooner than we originally discussed." Transplant. The word hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Transplant meant Emma's heart was failing beyond pharmaceutical intervention. Transplant meant months or years on a waiting list, hoping a donor became available. Transplant meant someone else's child had to die for his to live. The moral complexity of that equation made James physically sick. "Can I see her?" he asked quietly. Dr. Chen nodded. "We are moving her to the pediatric ICU. You can stay with her there." The pediatric intensive care unit was a special kind of hell, designed with cheerful murals and primary colors to disguise the fact that children were fighting for their lives inside. Emma was settled into a room with monitoring equipment that beeped and hummed, tubes and wires connecting her small body to machines keeping her alive. She looked impossibly fragile against the hospital sheets, her skin pale, and her breathing still labored despite the oxygen. James pulled a chair close to her bed and took her hand, carefully avoiding the IV line. Emma's eyes fluttered open, glassy with medication, but aware. "Am I dying?" she asked with the blunt honesty of a child too familiar with medical crises. No, baby James lied, hoping desperately it was true. "You're just having a hard time right now. The doctors are going to help you feel better." Emma seemed to accept this, or maybe she was too tired to argue. "Daddy," she whispered, "can you call Victoria? I want her to come." The request surprised James, even though it should not have. Emma had grown attached to Victoria over the past months, and Victoria had proven herself endlessly patient and present in ways that went far beyond professional courtesy. But it was 2:30 in the morning, and Victoria was his client, not family, not even officially his girlfriend, despite the dinner plans later this week that suddenly felt impossibly far away. "It is really late, sweetie," James said. "I do not want to bother her." She would not think it was a bother, Emma insisted with the certainty only children possess. "She told me I could call her any time." "Please, Daddy." James hesitated, then pulled out his phone and scrolled to Victoria's number. He stared at it for a long moment before typing out a message instead of calling. "Emma is in the hospital, pediatric ICU at New York Presbyterian. She is asking for you. No pressure if you cannot make it." He hit send before he could overthink it, then put the phone aside and focused on Emma, who was drifting in and out of sleep. The nurses came in regularly to check vitals and adjust medications. Dr. Chen returned with results from preliminary tests that confirmed what James already feared. Emma's heart function had declined significantly. They would need to consult with the transplant team in the morning. James nodded mechanically, absorbing information he would need to process later when he was not numb with fear. He was trying to figure out who he needed to call, what arrangements he needed to make if Emma had to stay hospitalized long-term, when the door to the room opened. Victoria walked in wearing yoga pants and an oversized sweatshirt, her hair pulled back in a messy bun. No makeup, looking nothing like the polished CEO who commanded boardrooms. She looked human and worried and real. "I came as soon as I got your message," she said quietly, her eyes moving from James to Emma, sleeping in the bed. "How is she?" James tried to answer but found his voice would not work properly. The adrenaline that had sustained him for the past few hours was wearing off, leaving him hollowed out and shaking. Victoria seemed to understand without him needing to explain. She crossed the room and pulled him into a hug that he did not know he needed until he was clinging to her and trying desperately not to fall apart. "She is getting worse." He finally managed the words muffled against Victoria's shoulder. "They are talking about transplant evaluation. I do not know what to do." "You are doing it," Victoria said firmly. "You are here. You are fighting for her. That is all you can do right now." They stood like that for a long moment, James drawing strength from her presence in a way that should have felt inappropriate, but just felt necessary. When he finally pulled back, Victoria was looking at him with an expression he could not quite identify. Something fierce and protective and tender all at once. "What do you need?" she asked. "I do not even know," James admitted. "To sleep, to think, to make this not be happening." Victoria glanced at Emma, then back at James. "Go home, shower, change clothes. Get a few hours of actual rest. I will stay with her." "I cannot leave her," James protested automatically. "You can?" "For a few hours," Victoria countered. "You are not going to be any good to Emma if you collapse from exhaustion. I will stay right here. If anything changes at all, I will call you immediately. You can be back in 20 minutes. James wanted to argue, but he was too tired and too overwhelmed. And there was something in Victoria's face that told him this was not just an offer of convenience. She wanted to be here, wanted to help in the only way she could. "Are you sure?" he asked. Victoria pulled a second chair close to Emma's bed and sat down with the posture of someone settling in for a siege. "I am sure. Go." James went too numb to process the significance of leaving his critically ill daughter with a woman who 3 months ago had been nothing more than a client. He made it home, showered on autopilot, and collapsed onto his bed, intending to rest for an hour. He woke up 4 hours later to sunlight streaming through his window and his phone ringing. His heart stopped until he saw it was Victoria calling, not the hospital. "She is stable," Victoria said, immediately reading his panic. "She woke up about an hour ago asking for pancakes, which the nurses say is a good sign. But James, there is something you should know." What he asked, already pulling on clean clothes. "She asked me if I was going to be her mom," Victoria said quietly. "I told her that was between you and me, and we had not figured that out yet. But she seemed satisfied with that answer. I thought you should know before you got back." James sat down on the edge of his bed phone, pressed to his ear, trying to process this information while running on 4 hours of sleep and constant terror. "Okay," he said. "Thank you for telling me. I am coming back now." The next 72 hours blurred together into an exhausting cycle of tests and consultations and waiting. Emma remained in the pediatric ICU while the transplant team evaluated her eligibility and urgency. James barely left except when nurses insisted he go to the cafeteria, or Victoria physically escorted him out for fresh air. Victoria stayed. Not constantly, she had a company to run, but more than anyone had a right to expect from someone who was not family. She showed up in the evenings after work with food from restaurants near the hospital, because she noticed James was not eating the cafeteria offerings. She sat with Emma during procedures when multiple adults were not allowed, keeping her calm and distracted. She read to Emma from books she bought in the hospital gift shop, her cultured voice making even children's stories sound elegant. James watched her transform in that hospital room. The CEO who ran a billion-dollar empire with ruthless efficiency became someone infinitely gentler with his daughter. She was patient when Emma was cranky from medications. She was honest when Emma asked scary questions about transplants. She was present in ways that felt remarkably like love, even though neither of them had named what was growing between them. On the third night after Emma finally fell asleep following a particularly difficult round of tests, Victoria and James stood in the hallway outside the ICU, both exhausted and emotionally wrung out. James was leaning against the wall trying to remember if he had returned any of the work calls he had been ignoring when Victoria spoke. "I have a preliminary board meeting tomorrow morning," she said. "There has been some concern about my leadership lately. Nothing concrete, just rumblings. I should probably attend." "Then go," James said immediately. "You have been here for 3 days. I can handle tomorrow." Victoria looked at him with an expression he could not quite read. "The meeting is at 8. Emma's transplant evaluation with the cardiac surgeon is at 8:30. You mentioned that earlier." James had completely forgotten about the timing conflict. "I can record it, or they can reschedule. Your company is important." "So is this?" Victoria replied quietly. "So are both of you. I am not leaving her. I am not leaving you. Let them have their meeting. I will deal with whatever consequences come from that decision." Before James could respond, his phone buzzed. Then Victoria's. They looked at their screens simultaneously and saw messages from multiple people. The content varied, but the essence was the same. An emergency board meeting had been called for the following morning. Attendance was mandatory. Evidence of financial mismanagement had been uncovered. Victoria's face went carefully blank in that way James recognized as her processing mode. She stepped away to make a call, her voice low and urgent as she spoke to someone James assumed was on her executive team. When she returned 5 minutes later, her expression was grim. "It is Richard," she said flatly. "My CFO. He has been building a case against me for months, apparently. Manipulation of financial data fabricated evidence of mismanagement, the whole corporate coup playbook. The board wants me there tomorrow to defend myself, or they are moving forward with a vote of no confidence." James felt his stomach drop. This was bad. This was potentially career-ending for Victoria. "You have to go," he said. "We will be fine here for a few hours." "The transplant surgeon will only be available tomorrow morning," Victoria said. "That consultation determines whether Emma gets listed. You should not have to handle that alone." "I can handle it," James insisted. "Your company is at stake." Victoria looked toward Emma's room, then back at James. She seemed to be fighting some internal battle, weighing options and calculating risks. Finally, she pulled out her phone and sent a rapid series of text messages. "What are you doing?" James asked. "Delegating," Victoria replied. "I have a board member I trust, Marcus Chen." James felt Victoria tense at the name, saw something flash across her face that looked like old pain. "That Marcus?" he asked carefully. "The very same," Victoria confirmed. "Turns out holding on to anger for 20 years is exhausting. We made peace about 6 months ago." He reached out to apologize to try to make amends. "I was not particularly receptive at first, but he was persistent. Now, he sits on my board and occasionally provides actually useful counsel. He is one of the few people who knows about the evidence I have been gathering against Richard." "You have evidence?" James asked, surprised. "I did not survive this long in corporate America by being naive," Victoria said with a trace of her usual steel. "I have been suspicious of Richard for months. The numbers were not quite adding up in ways most people would not notice. I have been quietly documenting discrepancies and tracking his communications. Marcus has copies of everything with instructions to present it to the board if Richard makes a move. So you could go to the meeting," James pointed out. "Let Marcus handle it." "I could," Victoria agreed. "Or I could stay here with you and Emma and let Marcus present the evidence on my behalf. Which sends a very clear message about my priorities and potentially costs me my company." "Then you should go," James said firmly, even though the thought of facing the transplant consultation alone terrified him. Victoria stepped closer, taking both his hands in hers. The fluorescent hospital lighting cast shadows under her eyes, highlighting her exhaustion. When she spoke, her voice was softer than he had ever heard it. "I spent 20 years building Horizon Enterprises. 20 years sacrificing everything personal for professional success. 20 years believing that power and control were the only things that mattered. And you know what I realized 3 days ago, watching you hold Emma's hand while she cried during that cardiac catheterization? None of it means anything if I do not have people I love to share it with." James felt his breath catch. That was the first time either of them had used any variation of that word. Victoria continued her grip on his hands, tightening. "If I go to that meeting, I am the same woman I have always been, prioritizing the empire over everything else, letting fear of loss dictate my choices. But if I stay here, if I choose you and Emma over defending my position, then maybe I finally become the person I have been trying to be for the past 6 months. The person who understands that some things are worth more than winning." "You could lose everything," James whispered. "I could," Victoria agreed. "Or I could gain everything that actually matters. Those seem like acceptable odds." She pulled out her phone and typed a message to Marcus with shaking hands. James could not see the full content, but he caught enough. "Trust you with this. Evidence files are in the location we discussed. Defend the company. I am exactly where I need to be." Then she turned off her phone completely, looked at James, and smiled with more genuine peace than he had ever seen on her face. "What happens if they vote you out?" he asked. "Then I will find something else to do with my time and considerable resources," Victoria replied. "Maybe I will finally take that photography class you mentioned. Or start a foundation focused on pediatric cardiology research. The possibilities are actually quite liberating when you stop being afraid." They stood in that hospital hallway, hands clasped on the edge of something that felt remarkably like a new beginning, built on the ruins of careful plans, and James understood that this was the real Victoria. Not the CEO in designer suits commanding boardrooms, not the Ice Queen who used control as armor, but the woman brave enough to choose vulnerability over power. Meanwhile, across Manhattan, in a penthouse apartment that overlooked Central Park, Richard Harmon was making final preparations for the meeting that would destroy Victoria Winters' career. He had been planning this for 5 years, ever since she was chosen for CEO over him. 5 years of careful documentation and strategic alliance building. 5 years of waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The moment had arrived. Richard had joined Horizon Enterprises 12 years ago as CFO, back when it was still a mid-sized company with potential but limited reach. He had helped Victoria scale it into the empire it became, working 100-hour weeks and sacrificing his personal life for the company's success. When the previous CEO retired and the board needed to choose a successor, Richard assumed his loyalty and expertise would be rewarded. Instead, they chose Victoria, younger, less experienced in some areas, but undeniably brilliant, and Richard suspected selected partially because having a female CEO played well with investors and the press. He smiled and congratulated her while internally seething with resentment that calcified over years into something darker. The beauty of his plan was its simplicity. Small alterations to financial data over months. Nothing dramatic enough to trigger immediate alarms, but significant enough to create a pattern of apparent mismanagement. Friendly conversations with board members where he would express concern about Victoria's recent distraction, her involvement with that photographer, her increasingly erratic decision-making. Seeds of doubt planted carefully and cultivated patiently. The final piece had been recruiting Victoria's assistant, a young woman named Jennifer, who had made the mistake of developing a gambling problem. Richard discovered her debts during a routine background check he had no authorization to run and saw opportunity. He approached her with an offer. Feed him information about Victoria's schedule and communications, and he would cover her debts plus guarantee her a position at Meridian Tech when they acquired the weakened Horizon. Jennifer had resisted at first, but $50,000 in gambling debts was persuasive. She started forwarding him Victoria's confidential emails and calendar. That was how Richard knew about Victoria's growing involvement with James Parker and his sick daughter. That was how he positioned it to the board as a CEO whose judgment was compromised by emotional entanglement with a vendor. Tomorrow morning, Richard would present his evidence to the board. Victoria would be caught off guard, probably still at that hospital with the photographer and his dying kid. She would not have time to mount an adequate defense. The board would vote no confidence. Richard would step in as interim CEO and immediately begin negotiations with Meridian Tech for a buyout that would make him enormously wealthy. It was perfect. Except for the variable Richard had not accounted for because Victoria had hidden it so carefully, even Jennifer did not know. The evidence Victoria had compiled on Richard's own activities. The paper trail documenting his communications with Meridian. The financial forensics proving his data manipulation. The recordings from the one time Richard got drunk at a company event and bragged to a colleague about his plans, not knowing Victoria had asked security to monitor that particular conversation. Marcus Chen had all of it. And while Richard was preparing his presentation, Marcus was preparing something far more devastating. The hospital room was quiet except for the steady beep of monitors tracking Emma's heart. James sat in the chair beside her bed, Victoria beside him, both watching the small girl sleep. The transplant consultation had been scheduled for 8:30, just half an hour after the board meeting started without Victoria. Tomorrow would determine everything. Whether Emma would be listed for a transplant, whether Victoria would still have a company, whether the future they were building together could survive the weight of these simultaneous crises. Victoria leaned her head against James's shoulder, exhaustion finally catching up with her. "I am terrified," she admitted quietly. "Of all of it." "Me too," James replied, taking her hand. "But at least we are terrified together now." Emma stirred slightly, mumbling something in her sleep about pancakes and puppies. Victoria smiled, despite everything that soft expression she got when looking at this child who had somehow become hers without anyone officially declaring it. Whatever happens tomorrow, James said, I want you to know something. You being here choosing to stay with us instead of fighting for your company, that means more than you probably realize. Emma is going to remember that you were here. I am going to remember that you were here. I would not want to be anywhere else, Victoria replied simply. They sat in silence as night deepened. Outside the hospital windows, two people who had spent years protecting themselves from exactly this kind of vulnerability, now facing the possibility of losing everything they had separately built to gain something together. They were only beginning to understand. Across town, the board meeting was hours away from beginning. Richard's presentation was polished and damning. Marcus's counter-evidence was comprehensive and devastating. The corporate battle that would determine Horizon's future was set, but in a pediatric ICU room a different kind of battle was being fought. The battle to keep a little girl's heart beating. The battle to build a family from broken pieces. The battle to believe that love might actually be worth the terrifying risk of loss. James looked at Victoria, really looked at her, and saw someone who had faced down corporate raiders and hostile takeovers without flinching, now trembling slightly at the prospect of opening her heart completely. He saw the woman who built walls now choosing to tear them down. He saw his future if they could just survive the present. Emma woke briefly, saw them both there, and smiled with the pure contentment of a child who knows she is loved and protected, even in a hospital surrounded by machines keeping her alive. She reached for both their hands, pulling them close. Tell me the story again, she murmured sleepily. About the princess who forgot how to be scared. That is not a real story, sweetie, James said gently. You made that up. Then make it real, Emma insisted. Please. So James and Victoria took turns creating a story about a princess who ruled a kingdom, but never learned to be happy until she met a knight and his daughter who taught her that the strongest magic was choosing love over fear. It was sentimental and probably terrible storytelling, but Emma loved it. And by the time they finished, she was sleeping peacefully again. Victoria wiped tears from her eyes that she did not bother hiding anymore. That is what I want, she whispered, that ending, where love wins. Then we fight for it, James replied. Tomorrow and every day after, until we get it. They stayed like that through the night, taking turns sleeping in uncomfortable chairs, waking each other when nurses came for checks, holding Emma's hand and each other's, and hoping desperately that hope was enough, because tomorrow everything would either fall apart completely or somehow impossibly come together. The boardroom on the 42nd floor of Horizon Enterprises was designed to intimidate. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan. A table carved from a single piece of walnut that cost more than most people's cars. Chairs that were ergonomically perfect and psychologically uncomfortable. Richard Harmon had chosen this room specifically for the emergency meeting because he wanted Victoria to feel the weight of what she was losing. Except Victoria was not there. The board members filed in at 7:55, coffee in hand, expressions ranging from concerned to curious to outright hostile. 12 people who collectively controlled the future of a company worth $3.7 billion. Richard stood at the head of the table, his presentation queued up on the massive screen behind him, confident and ready to destroy the woman who had taken what should have been his. Marcus Chen was the last to arrive, sliding into his seat at exactly 8 o'clock, with the calm demeanor of someone who held cards no one else knew were in play. He nodded at Richard with polite acknowledgement, giving nothing away. "Shall we begin?" Richard said, not bothering with pleasantries. "We are all aware of why we are here. There are significant concerns about Victoria Winter's leadership and decision-making over the past several months. I have compiled evidence that I believe warrants immediate action." He clicked to the first slide. Financial projections that showed Horizon missing targets by increasingly wide margins. Except the numbers were manipulated, altered just enough to paint a picture of mismanagement without being obviously fraudulent to anyone who was not looking carefully. "As you can see," Richard continued, "we have experienced consistent underperformance in 3 consecutive quarters. This coincides directly with Ms. Winters' involvement in personal matters that have distracted her from her fiduciary responsibilities to this company and its shareholders. What personal matters? Asked Eleanor Bradshaw, the board member who had been with Horizon since before Victoria became CEO. Richard clicked to the next slide, which showed a timeline. Dates when Victoria had canceled meetings. Instances when she had delegated responsibilities. A photograph pulled from social media showing her leaving a children's hospital with James Parker. Miss Winters has become romantically involved with a vendor, Richard said, letting the implication hang. A photographer hired for our annual report who has a critically ill daughter. While I have sympathy for the situation, the fact remains that our CEO's judgment has been compromised by emotional attachment. She has been prioritizing this relationship over the company's interests. That is quite an accusation, Marcus said mildly. Do you have evidence that this relationship has actually harmed the company beyond these financial numbers? Richard was ready for this. He had prepared a comprehensive case. He clicked through slides showing delayed strategic decisions meetings. Victoria had left early projects where she had been less involved than usual. Each piece alone was innocuous. Together, they painted a picture of a CEO losing her edge. Furthermore, Richard continued, I have been approached by Meridian Tech with a buyout offer. They are prepared to acquire Horizon at a significant premium to current market value. Given Ms. Winters' recent performance and the trajectory we are on, I believe we should seriously consider this opportunity. The room erupted in murmurs. A buyout was not something to be discussed lightly, especially not without the CEO present. Where is Victoria? Eleanor asked sharply. She should be here to defend herself against these accusations. Richard had anticipated this question as well. He arranged his face into an expression of regret. Ms. Winters was informed of this meeting. She chose not to attend. In fact, she sent word through Marcus that she had other priorities this morning. I believe that tells you everything you need to know about her commitment to Horizon. Several board members looked troubled by this. The optics were terrible. A CEO skipping an emergency board meeting to deal with personal matters was exactly the kind of thing that got you fired. Marcus leaned back in his chair, utterly relaxed. Would you like to know what those other priorities are? He asked conversationally. I think we can all guess, Richard said dismissively. She is at the hospital with her boyfriend and his dying daughter. Again, sympathetic situation, but not an excuse for abandoning her responsibilities. Marcus smiled, and there was something dangerous in it that made Richard's confidence waver slightly. You are absolutely right that Victoria is at the hospital. She is there because Emma Parker, age 11, is being evaluated for a heart transplant this morning. The consultation is happening right now with one of the country's top pediatric cardiac surgeons who flies in from Boston exactly twice a month. Missing this appointment would mean waiting another month, which Emma does not have according to her doctors. The room went very quiet. Marcus continued, his voice still mild but with an edge now that cut. Victoria chose to be there instead of here because she made a decision about what actually matters, and because she trusted me to handle this situation on her behalf. So, shall we discuss the real issues at hand? Richard felt the first whisper of unease. This was not going according to plan. What real issues, he demanded. Marcus opened his laptop and connected it to the screen, replacing Richard's presentation with his own. The first slide was a series of financial documents. Your financial projections are very compelling, Richard. They would be more compelling if they were accurate. The documents on screen showed the real numbers. Horizon was not missing targets. In fact, under Victoria's leadership, they were slightly exceeding projections in most areas. Marcus methodically walked through each of Richard's claims, showing how the data had been manipulated. A decimal point moved here, a quarter's results attributed to a different period there. Nothing that would trigger automatic fraud detection, but everything designed to create a false narrative. This is absurd, Richard sputtered. Those are the official numbers from my department. They are numbers from your department, Marcus agreed. But not the official ones. These are the official numbers verified by our external auditors as of yesterday. Victoria asked them to run an independent review 3 months ago when she first noticed discrepancies. Richard felt the ground shifting under him. This was not possible. Victoria could not have known. He had been so careful. Marcus was not finished. He clicked to the next slide, which showed a series of email exchanges. These are communications between you and James Whitmore, CEO of Meridian Tech. They date back 6 months. In them, you discuss your plans to create evidence of mismanagement, force Victoria out, and position Horizon for a buyout that would make you Meridian's chief technology officer, with a compensation package of $12 million plus equity. The boardroom erupted. Several members were on their feet. Richard's face had gone from confident to ashen. "How did you get those emails?" he demanded. "Your IT department has robust security," Marcus replied. "Unfortunately for you, you used your personal email for these conversations. Victoria's security team has been monitoring your communications for the past 2 months. Perfectly legal, given that you were using company resources to access your personal accounts, and she had reasonable suspicion of malfeasance." Richard looked around the table at faces that had gone from sympathetic to hostile in the span of 10 minutes. This is a setup he tried. "She is trying to deflect from her own incompetence by attacking me." Eleanor Bradshaw cut him off with a voice that could freeze fire. "Mr. Harmon, I have served on this board for 15 years. I have watched Victoria build this company from a struggling mid-tier operation into an industry leader. What I am seeing on this screen is evidence of fraud, embezzlement, and corporate espionage. What I am not seeing is any legitimate concern about her leadership." Marcus clicked through more slides. Bank records showing payments from Meridian to Richard's personal accounts. Documented instances of him deliberately sabotaging projects to create the appearance of poor management. Communications with Jennifer, Victoria's assistant, showing how he had coerced her into spying and leaking confidential information. With each revelation, Richard's position became more untenable. He tried to argue to deflect, to claim the evidence was fabricated, but it was comprehensive and damning. Victoria had not just suspected him. She had built an airtight case over months of careful investigation. The meeting that was supposed to end Victoria's career instead ended Richard's. By 9 o'clock, he had been formally removed from his position and escorted from the building by security. The board had voted unanimously to support Victoria's continued leadership and to pursue both criminal and civil action against Richard for his activities. Eleanor called Victoria personally to deliver the news. "The board stands behind you," she said firmly. "We apologize for doubting you even briefly. Take the time you need at the hospital. We will handle the transition here." Victoria took the call in the hallway outside the transplant surgeon's office where James was meeting with Dr. Rashid. Her hands were shaking with relief and residual adrenaline. "Thank you, Eleanor. I appreciate the board's confidence. I will return to the office tomorrow." "Actually," Eleanor said, "before you do, there is something the board would like to discuss. We have been reviewing your proposal for restructuring our benefits and corporate culture initiatives. The one you submitted last month about family medical leave and remote work flexibility and the Pediatric Cardiology Research Foundation." Victoria had almost forgotten about that proposal. She had drafted it late one night after spending the evening with James and Emma, seeing firsthand how impossible it was to balance serious medical needs with rigid corporate structures. She had submitted it to the board more as a statement of values than expecting actual approval. "We would like to vote on it at next week's regular meeting," Eleanor continued. "Personally, I think it is exactly the kind of forward-thinking leadership that sets Horizon apart. You built a successful company, Victoria. Now you are showing us how to build a meaningful one. That is why we chose you as CEO in the first place." Victoria ended the call and stood in the hospital corridor for a long moment, letting the magnitude of what just happened sink in. She had won. Richard was gone. Her position was secure. The company she built over 2 decades was still hers. And yet, standing there in a hallway that smelled of antiseptic and recycled air, wearing yesterday's clothes and running on 3 hours of sleep, Victoria realized the victory felt smaller than she expected. Not meaningless, but not the most important thing anymore either. The door to Dr. Rashid's office opened, and James emerged looking shell-shocked. Victoria crossed to him immediately, reading disaster in his expression. "What did he say?" she asked. James seemed to have trouble forming words. Dr. Rashid followed him out, a slight man in his 50s with kind eyes and the bearing of someone who delivered life-changing news regularly. "Miss Winters," he greeted her. "James mentioned you are part of Emma's support system. Perhaps you should hear this as well." They moved to a small consultation room where Emma was coloring at a table supervised by a nurse. Dr. Rashid pulled up Emma's latest test results on a tablet. "Emma's heart function has declined more rapidly than we anticipated," he explained, his voice gentle but direct. "The restrictive cardiomyopathy is progressing to end stage. We need to list her for transplant immediately. She is young and otherwise healthy, which works in her favor, but the waiting list for pediatric hearts is significant. Average wait time is 6 to 12 months, assuming a suitable donor becomes available." "What happens if we do not find a donor in that time frame?" James asked, though his voice made clear he already knew. "We manage her symptoms as aggressively as possible and hope," Dr. Rashid said. "But I will not mislead you. Without a transplant, Emma's prognosis is poor. We are looking at months, not years." Victoria felt like she had been punched. She looked at Emma, this vibrant, funny, smart little girl who had taught her what it meant to love without reservation, and could not process the idea that she might not be here a year from now. "What can we do?" Victoria heard herself ask. "What resources do you need? What specialists should we consult? Is there anything experimental we should consider?" Dr. Rashid looked at her with something like approval. "We are already doing everything current medical science allows. The foundation you mentioned establishing focused on pediatric cardiac research that could help children like Emma in the future. But for Emma specifically right now, we need a donor heart. Everything else is just buying time and hoping." The three of them sat in that small room while Dr. Rashid explained the transplant process in detail. The surgery itself, the anti-rejection medications Emma would need for life, the monitoring and follow-up care, the statistics on survival rates that were better than they used to be but still sobering. Emma would be listed as status 1A, the highest priority. They would install a defibrillator immediately in case her heart rhythm became dangerously unstable. She would need to stay within 2 hours of the transplant center at all times, because when a heart became available, they would have only a small window to perform the surgery. "Your lives are about to change significantly," Dr. Rashid said. "This is a marathon, not a sprint. You will need support systems in place, both of you." After the consultation, James took Emma to the playroom where she could watch cartoons and pretend to be a normal kid for a while. Victoria stood with him, watching through the window as Emma settled on a beanbag chair, already looking tired from the short walk. "I cannot afford this," James said quietly. "The transplant, the medications after the monitoring. Even with insurance, we are talking hundreds of thousands of dollars. I do not have it. I have maybe 10,000 in savings, and that is already earmarked for her care." "You are not doing this alone," Victoria said firmly. "I cannot ask you to pay for my daughter's medical care," James protested. "That is not why I let you into our lives." Victoria turned to face him fully. "You did not let me into your lives. I fought my way in because you and Emma became the most important people in my world, and I did not even realize it was happening until it was too late to protect myself. So you are not asking me for anything. I am telling you, whatever this costs, whatever we need to do, we do it together." James looked at her with an expression that was part gratitude, part desperation, part something deeper. "I love you," he said. I probably should not say that now when everything is falling apart. But I love you, and I need you to know that before anything else goes wrong." Victoria felt tears sliding down her face and did not bother wiping them away. "I love you too," she replied. "I have for months, but I was too scared to admit it. Scared that if I wanted something this much it would be taken away. But I am done being scared. We fight for her. We fight for us, whatever it takes." They stood together in that hospital hallway holding each other while families moved around them dealing with their own medical crises and made promises that neither of them knew if they could keep but were determined to try anyway. The defibrillator implantation surgery was scheduled for the next day. Emma would be hospitalized for at least a week while they stabilized her on new medications and monitored her response. James called the few photography clients he had booked and canceled everything. Victoria sent an email to her executive team delegating all non-critical decisions and clearing her calendar indefinitely. That evening, after Emma was settled in her hospital room for the night, James walked Victoria to the elevator. Neither of them wanted to separate even for the few hours Victoria needed to go home and sleep in an actual bed. But Emma's room only had one pull-out chair, and James needed to be the one there when she woke up. "Thank you," James said as they waited for the elevator. "For staying, for choosing us, for loving my daughter." "Our daughter," Victoria corrected gently. "Maybe not legally yet, but in every way that matters. She is ours." James pulled a small box from his jacket pocket. It was clearly not expensive, probably bought from the hospital gift shop. He opened it to reveal a simple silver ring with a small diamond that was more symbolic than impressive. "This is not how I planned to do this," he said. "I was going to take you to dinner somewhere nice and make a whole production of it. But standing here in a hospital after the worst day, and somehow also one of the best days, it feels like the right time to stop waiting for perfect circumstances." He took her hand. "Victoria Winters, will you marry me? Will you take on a struggling photographer and his sick daughter and all the chaos and uncertainty that comes with us? Will you build a family with me, even though we have no idea if we will have enough time?" Victoria looked at the ring, then at James, then down the hallway toward Emma's room. Every logical part of her brain was screaming that this was too fast, too complicated, too risky. You could lose everything, the voice said. His daughter might die. You might build a family and watch it fall apart. You might love them and they might leave. But a newer voice, one that sounded remarkably like Emma, asking if Victoria was going to be her mom, said something different. Some things are worth the risk. Some people are worth loving, even if it hurts. Some families are worth building, even if they are built on hope instead of certainty. "Yes," Victoria said simply, "to all of it. The chaos and the uncertainty and the fear and the love. Yes." James slid the ring onto her finger. It was too big, would need to be resized, but Victoria decided she liked the imperfection of it. Liked that this engagement was happening in a hospital hallway instead of a fancy restaurant. Liked that they were choosing each other not in spite of the difficult circumstances, but because of them. Because adversity had stripped away all pretense and left only what was real. The elevator arrived. Victoria stepped inside, then turned back to James. "We're going to get through this," she said with more confidence than she felt. "All three of us together. I am not losing either of you. I am going to hold you to that promise," James replied. "Good," Victoria said as the doors started to close. "I always keep my promises." She rode down 42 floors in that elevator, looking at the too big ring on her finger, and allowed herself to feel something she had not felt in 20 years. Hope that was not tempered by cynicism. Love that was not calculated or strategic. The terrifying, beautiful possibility that maybe she could have both the life she built and the family she craved. Her phone buzzed with messages from her executive team about Richard's removal and the transition plan. Messages from board members expressing support. A message from Marcus saying he handled everything and she should focus on what mattered. Another message from Eleanor about scheduling the vote on her restructuring proposal. Victoria looked at all of it and felt oddly detached. Yes, Horizon mattered. Yes, her career was important. But standing in that elevator engaged to a man who had taught her that strength and vulnerability were not opposites. Planning to be a mother to a child who might not survive the year, Victoria understood that she had already won the only battle that mattered. She had chosen love over fear, had chosen connection over control, had chosen to be fully human instead of safely numb. Whatever happened next with Emma's health and the company, and all the uncertainty that the future held, Victoria Winters was no longer facing it alone. She had a family now, imperfect and fragile and absolutely worth fighting for. The elevator doors opened to the hospital lobby. Victoria stepped out into the cool evening air and felt lighter than she had in decades, despite carrying more fear and more hope than she ever allowed herself before. She looked back up at the hospital windows glowing in the darkening sky, knowing somewhere up there James was sitting beside Emma's bed, keeping watch, and she smiled. Tomorrow, they would start the transplant evaluation process. Tomorrow, she would return to the office and begin restructuring Horizon to reflect the values she had learned from loving this family. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new fears, and new reasons to question whether choosing vulnerability over armor was sustainable. But tonight, she was engaged to the man she loved and committed to being a mother to a child who needed her, and that felt remarkably like victory, even wrapped in uncertainty. Victoria walked to her car, already planning what she needed to do. Call her lawyer about starting adoption proceedings for Emma, set up trusts to ensure Emma's medical care regardless of what happened, accelerate the foundation launch, restructure her will, all the practical steps that came with building a family, but also the impractical things. Learning to braid hair because Emma had mentioned wanting her hair in braids like the other girls at school. Researching heart-healthy recipes, even though Emma was probably going to want chicken nuggets. Figuring out how to be a mother when she had spent 42 years actively avoiding that possibility. The learning curve would be steep. Victoria was used to being competent and in control, and nothing about parenting a medically fragile 11-year-old was going to be either of those things. But for the first time in her carefully controlled life, Victoria was excited about the challenge instead of terrified of potential failure. She drove back to her penthouse, took the longest shower of her life, and fell into bed still wearing the too big engagement ring. Her last thought before sleep claimed her was of Emma asking if she was going to be her new mom, and Victoria's answer now carried the weight of a promise that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. Yes, she thought. Yes, I am going to be your mom, and I am going to move heaven and earth to make sure you are here long enough for us to figure out what that means together. 3 months after the proposal that happened in a hospital hallway instead of a fancy restaurant, Victoria Winters sat on the edge of a pediatric hospital bed, watching Emma Parker decorate the walls of her semi-permanent room with drawings and photographs. The defibrillator implantation had gone smoothly. The new medication regimen had stabilized Emma's heart function enough that she could go home between appointments. But the transplant list was exactly as Dr. Rashid had warned, a waiting game with no guarantees. Emma had been admitted again 2 days ago after experiencing an arrhythmia episode at school. Nothing life-threatening, but serious enough that the transplant team wanted her under observation. She had taken the hospitalization with the weary acceptance of a child who had spent too much time in medical facilities, asking only if she could bring her art supplies and if Victoria would stay. Victoria had not left except to shower and change clothes. She was wearing jeans and a Horizon Enterprises sweatshirt that one of her employees had given her as a joke gift last Christmas, back when the idea of their CEO wearing anything with a corporate logo on it would have been laughable. Now it felt comfortable in ways her designer suits never had. "That one needs to go higher," Emma instructed, pointing to a photograph James had taken of the 3 of them at Central Park last month. Victoria had her arm around Emma's shoulders. James had his arm around Victoria. They looked like a family because that was what they had become, unconventional, and still figuring out the details, but undeniably real. Victoria climbed onto the bed, carefully avoiding the IV line and monitor wires, and taped the photo where Emma directed. "This good. Perfect," Emma declared. "Now everyone who comes in will know I have the best family." The casual way Emma said it, like it was established fact rather than something they were still constructing day by day, made Victoria's throat tight. She settled back beside Emma on the narrow hospital bed, and they both surveyed their handiwork. The sterile white walls were now covered with evidence of a life being lived despite medical complications. Drawings Emma had made. Photos of better days. A banner that said, "Emma is brave," that the nursing staff had created. A card from Emma's class at school that everyone had signed. "Tell me about the new medication Dr. Rashid wants to try," Emma said, because at 11 she had learned to be an active participant in her own medical care rather than a passive patient. Victoria pulled up the research on her tablet, explaining in terms Emma could understand how the drug worked to help her heart pump more efficiently. They had fallen into this routine over the past months, Victoria researching everything exhaustively and then translating it into language that was honest but not terrifying. Emma listened carefully, asking smart questions that reminded Victoria this child was brilliant beneath all the medical complexity. They were discussing potential side effects when Emma suddenly grabbed Victoria's hand, her small fingers squeezing tight. Her other hand went to her chest, her face contorting in pain that she tried to hide but could not quite manage. Victoria hit the call button while reaching for Emma, years of corporate crisis management translating seamlessly into medical emergency response. The nurse arrived within seconds, followed quickly by the resident on call. Victoria moved out of the way but stayed close enough that Emma could see her, could draw strength from her presence. The monitors showed what Victoria had learned to recognize as a dangerous arrhythmia. Emma's heart was beating irregularly fast, then slow, then fast again, in a pattern that made the medical staff move with urgent efficiency. They adjusted medications through her IV, checked the defibrillator settings, spoke to each other in medical shorthand that Victoria had learned to partially decode. It felt like hours, but was probably only 10 minutes before Emma's heart rhythm stabilized. The attending physician, a woman named Dr. Patel, who had seen them through multiple crises, now checked Emma's vitals one more time before turning to Victoria. "She is stable now," Dr. Patel said. "But these episodes are becoming more frequent and more severe. We need to have a conversation with you and Mr. Parker about what that means." Victoria knew what it meant. Emma was running out of time. The transplant list could not move fast enough. They needed a donor heart soon, or the next arrhythmia might be the one the defibrillator could not correct. James arrived 20 minutes later, having rushed from a photography session he could not afford to miss. Victoria met him in the hallway and watched his face crumble when she explained what had happened. They held each other outside Emma's room, two people trying to be strong enough for a child who should not have to need them to be this strong. When they went back into the room together, Emma was sitting up coloring like nothing had happened, the resilience of childhood on full display. She looked up and smiled at her father with such genuine joy that Victoria had to turn away briefly to compose herself. "Daddy," Emma called out. "Look what Victoria and I did to the walls. Do you think the nurses will let us keep it when I leave?" "I think they will let you do anything you want," James said, his voice only slightly unsteady. "You are their favorite patient." "That is because I share my cookies," Emma replied seriously. They spent the rest of the afternoon in that hospital room, the three of them pretending this was normal. James edited photos on his laptop, while Emma colored, and Victoria reviewed work documents on her tablet. To an outside observer, they might have looked like any family spending a quiet day together. Only the medical equipment and the tension underlying every moment gave away the truth. That evening, after Emma finally fell asleep, James and Victoria met with Dr. Patel and Dr. Rashid to discuss the trajectory of Emma's condition. The news was what they had been dreading. Emma's heart was failing faster than the medications could compensate. She would need to be hospitalized continuously, now kept close to the surgical suite in case a donor heart became available. How long? James asked the question they had all been avoiding. Dr. Rashid's expression was compassionate but honest. Weeks, possibly a few months if we are lucky. Her status on the transplant list is as high as it can be. If a suitable donor becomes available, she will be first in line. But we cannot predict when or if that will happen. Victoria felt the world tilt slightly. Weeks. They were measuring Emma's life in weeks now instead of years. The little girl who had asked if Victoria was going to be her mom might not be here long enough to see the adoption paperwork finalized. Might not be here long enough to be a flower girl at their wedding. Might not be here at all a year from now. James looked like he was drowning. Victoria took his hand and squeezed, trying to communicate strength she did not actually feel. They thanked the doctors and walked back to Emma's room in silence, both processing the impossible reality they were facing. The next morning, Victoria woke in the uncomfortable chair beside Emma's bed to find her phone buzzing insistently. Eleanor Bradshaw was calling, which was unusual. Eleanor preferred email for anything that could wait and only called for genuine emergencies. Eleanor Victoria answered quietly, stepping into the hallway so as not to wake Emma. "I apologize for calling so early," Eleanor said. "But I wanted you to hear this directly from me. The board voted last night to approve your restructuring proposal. All of it. The family medical leave policy, the remote work flexibility, the Pediatric Cardiology Research Foundation. We are allocating $50 million to establish it with you as the founding director if you choose to accept." Victoria leaned against the wall momentarily overwhelmed. $50 million. Enough to fund serious research. Enough to potentially help children like Emma in the future, even if they could not help Emma herself in time. The board also voted to create a new position. Eleanor continued. Chief Purpose Officer. Someone whose sole responsibility is ensuring that Horizon's success is measured not just in profit, but in positive impact. We would like to offer you that position with the understanding that you would step back from the CEO role, but remain actively involved in strategic direction. "You want me to stop being CEO?" Victoria said, making sure she understood correctly. "We want you to have the flexibility to be present for your family while still contributing your vision to the company," Eleanor clarified. Richard's betrayal taught us something important. We have been so focused on quarterly earnings that we forgot why we are building this company in the first place. You are showing us a different way. We want to support that. Victoria looked back toward Emma's room, where through the window she could see James sleeping in the other chair, exhausted from keeping vigil. She thought about the past 3 months of trying to run a billion-dollar company while being present for a critically ill child. The constant tension between professional obligations and personal priorities. The guilt every time she chose one over the other. "I need to discuss this with my family," Victoria said. "Can I have some time to think about it?" "Of course," Eleanor replied. "Take whatever time you need. We are not going anywhere." Victoria ended the call and stood in that hospital hallway trying to process what had just happened. The company she had built was offering her a way to stay involved without sacrificing her family. Was offering to restructure itself around values she had learned from loving James and Emma. Was proving that maybe success and humanity were not mutually exclusive after all. She returned to Emma's room to find her awake watching the sunrise through the window with the contemplative expression she sometimes got that made her seem older than 11. "Victoria," Emma said softly, "can I ask you something?" "Anything," Victoria replied, settling beside her on the bed. "When I get my new heart, will I still be me?" Emma's voice was small and uncertain. "Or will I be different because part of me is from someone else?" Victoria thought carefully about how to answer. This was a question about identity and mortality and the strange miracle of organ transplantation, and Emma deserved honesty wrapped in reassurance. "You will always be you," Victoria said firmly. Your heart is what keeps you alive, but you are so much more than your heart. You are your terrible jokes and your beautiful drawings and your kindness to everyone you meet. You are the way you see the world, through a camera lens like your dad taught you. You are the bravest person I have ever known. A new heart will help you live longer, but it will not change who you are at your core. Emma considered this, then nodded. Okay, I just wanted to make sure because I like who I am, even the sick parts. The wisdom of that statement, the acceptance of her whole self, including the parts that were failing, made Victoria want to weep. Instead, she pulled Emma close and held her carefully, mindful of the wires and tubes, but needing the connection. I like who you are too, Victoria whispered. Every single part of you. You are perfect exactly as you are. They stayed like that until James woke up, and then the three of them had breakfast together from the hospital cafeteria because Emma insisted hospital pancakes were actually good if you used enough syrup. It was a small moment of normalcy in the midst of crisis, and Victoria held on to it fiercely. Over the next 2 months, Emma remained hospitalized while they waited for a donor heart. Victoria divided her time between the hospital and Horizon, working with the board to transition into her new role as Chief Purpose Officer. The shift was harder than she expected in some ways, easier in others. Letting go of the CEO title meant releasing control she had held tightly for 15 years. But it also meant freedom to focus on building something that mattered in ways quarterly earnings never could. The Pediatric Cardiology Research Foundation became her primary focus. She recruited top researchers, established partnerships with major medical centers, created funding mechanisms for families struggling with medical costs. Every decision was informed by her experience with Emma, every policy designed to help families like theirs navigate the impossible intersection of love and medicine and money. James continued photographing when he could, though most of his work now came from hospital staff who wanted family portraits or milestone documentation. He had become a fixture in the pediatric ward, his camera capturing moments of joy even in the midst of illness. The photos he took during this time were some of his best work, raw and honest and heartbreaking in their beauty. And Emma waited. She colored and read books and did schoolwork with the hospital tutor. She made friends with other pediatric patients and wrote them encouraging notes. She asked Victoria to teach her about business and James to teach her about photography. She lived as fully as anyone could, while tethered to machines and medication, demonstrating a grace under pressure that humbled everyone around her. The call came on a Wednesday evening in late November, 6 months after the emergency board meeting that saved Victoria's career, and 4 months after Emma had been admitted for continuous monitoring. Victoria was reviewing foundation grant applications when her phone rang. Dr. Rashid's number. "We have a heart," he said without preamble. 8-year-old donor from upstate. Size is a near-perfect match. We can do the surgery tonight if you and James consent. Victoria's hand started shaking so badly she nearly dropped the phone. A heart. After months of waiting and hoping and pretending they were not constantly terrified, they finally had a heart. She found James outside Emma's room talking to a nurse. One look at Victoria's face, and he knew. The nurse who had become invested in Emma's case over the months actually cheered quietly. They went into Emma's room together to tell her. She was watching a movie on the tablet, looking small and tired but still vibrantly herself. When they explained that a heart was available and the surgery would happen in a few hours, she looked scared for the first time in months. "What if something goes wrong?" she asked. "What if the new heart does not work?" James sat on one side of her bed, Victoria on the other, both holding her hands. "We are going to think positive thoughts," James said. "We are going to believe that this is going to work and you are going to wake up with a strong, healthy heart. And we are going to be right there when you wake up," Victoria added. "Both of us. We are not going anywhere." Emma looked between them, then nodded with the bravery of a child who had no choice but to be brave. "Okay," she said, "let's do this." The pre-surgical preparations moved quickly. Consent form signed. Explanations given. Anesthesia team consulted. Emma was surprisingly calm through all of it, asking practical questions about the surgery and recovery while James and Victoria tried not to fall apart. When they finally wheeled Emma toward the operating room, she looked back at them with eyes that were scared but determined. "I love you, Daddy," she said. "I love you, Victoria." "We love you too, baby." James managed his voice breaking. "We will see you soon." The surgical waiting room became their world for the next 8 hours. James paced. Victoria made lists of things they would need for Emma's recovery. They held each other when the fear became too much. They prayed to gods they were not sure they believed in. They waited while a team of surgeons tried to give Emma a future. Dr. Rashid emerged at 4 in the morning, still in surgical scrubs, looking exhausted but cautiously optimistic. "The surgery went well," he said. "The new heart is functioning beautifully. Emma is in recovery now." The next 48 hours are critical, but she made it through the hardest part. James actually collapsed into a chair, overcome with relief. Victoria stood frozen, afraid to believe this might actually work after months of preparing for the worst. "Can we see her?" Victoria asked. "Soon," Dr. Rashid promised. "Let the recovery team get her stabilized, then you can sit with her while she wakes up." Emma emerged from anesthesia slowly confused and in pain, but alive. Alive with a heart that beat strong and steady, no longer struggling against the restrictions that had been killing her. James and Victoria sat on either side of her bed, holding her hands, watching monitors that now showed numbers that looked like hope instead of despair. The recovery was long and complicated, as Dr. Rashid had warned it would be. Emma spent 3 weeks in the ICU, then another month in the step-down unit. She had to learn to trust her new heart, to believe her body could do things that had been impossible before. The anti-rejection medications made her sick. The surgical incision was painful. The emotional toll of having survived what so many children did not was complicated in ways no one had quite anticipated. But she healed. Slowly, imperfectly, but undeniably she healed. 5 months after the transplant, Emma was strong enough to be discharged home with careful monitoring. The doctors warned it would be months more before she was fully recovered. Years before, they would know the long-term outcome. But for now, she was alive and improving, and that was everything. James and Victoria got married in Emma's hospital room 2 weeks before her discharge. Not the wedding anyone had envisioned, but perfect in its own way. Emma wore a flower crown the nurses had made. Victoria wore jeans and the cashmere sweater Emma had picked out for her. James wore the suit he had worn to their first dinner together because Emma said it was lucky. The ceremony was officiated by the hospital chaplain with nurses and doctors as witnesses. Emma stood between them, still weak but beaming, as they exchanged vows they had written themselves. Promises about facing uncertainty together. Promises about choosing love over fear. Promises about building a family that was stronger for being tested. When the chaplain pronounced them married, Emma threw flower petals she had saved from a bouquet someone sent and declared it the best wedding ever, even though she had never been to another wedding to compare it to. They ate cake that the cafeteria staff had made specially. They took photos that James set up on a tripod timer because he refused to have a wedding without documentation. It was nothing like the elaborate celebration Victoria might have imagined back when she thought success meant controlling every detail. It was chaotic and imperfect and absolutely beautiful, exactly like the family they had become. 2 years after that hospital wedding, Victoria stood in a Manhattan art gallery watching James interact with collectors and critics at his first major solo exhibition. The show was titled Survival and Grace, featuring photographs from the past 3 years documenting their journey through medical crisis and into something resembling normal life. Images of Emma in the hospital. Images of Victoria asleep in uncomfortable chairs. Images of hope and fear existing simultaneously. The response had been overwhelming. Critics praised the emotional honesty. Collectors were buying pieces faster than the gallery could put up sold stickers. James was finally getting recognition for the talent Victoria had seen in him from the beginning, back when he was just a struggling photographer who needed corporate work to pay his daughter's medical bills. Emma, now 14 and healthier than she had been in years, moved through the gallery with confidence, explaining her father's artistic choices to anyone who would listen. She wore a dress she had picked out herself, her long dark hair styled in a way that made her look older than she was. The scar from her transplant surgery was hidden beneath the fabric, but Victoria knew it was there, a permanent reminder of how close they had come to losing her. Victoria's hand rested on her visibly pregnant belly, feeling the baby kick as if responding to the energy in the gallery. This child, a daughter they had decided to name Sarah after James's first wife, because honoring the past was part of building the future, was due in 6 weeks. Unplanned, but deeply wanted. Proof that their family could grow and change and survive. Emma appeared at Victoria's side, slipping her hand into Victoria's free hand with the casual affection of a daughter who had long ago stopped questioning whether Victoria was really her mom. Mom, she said, using the title that had evolved naturally over time. People keep asking if any of these photos are for sale. I told them to talk to Dad, but he's being all weird about it. Your dad is allowed to be weird on his opening night, Victoria replied with a smile. This is a big deal for him. For all of us, Emma corrected. These photos are our family story. It feels strange to sell pieces of it to strangers. The wisdom in that observation, the understanding that art could be both personal and public, reminded Victoria how much Emma had grown in the past 2 years. No longer the sick child they had feared losing, but a teenager with opinions and dreams, and a future that seemed possible now in ways it had not before. James joined them, wrapping an arm around Victoria's shoulders and ruffling Emma's carefully styled hair, which she protested even while leaning into the gesture. "This is surreal," he said. "People are talking about my work like it matters." "It does matter," Victoria said firmly. "You captured something true and difficult and beautiful. That always matters. I could not have done it without you," James replied, looking at her with an expression that still made her heart stutter even after 2 years of marriage. "Either of you. This whole exhibition exists because you taught me it was okay to be vulnerable." Emma made a face. "Are you going to get all mushy because there are important art people here and it will be embarrassing?" They all laughed, the easy, comfortable laughter of a family that had survived crisis and come out stronger. An art critic approached, wanting to discuss James's technique, and he excused himself to handle the professional obligations of the evening. Emma spotted a friend from school across the gallery and went to drag them over to see her favorite photographs. Victoria stood alone for a moment, watching her family navigate this milestone, her hand still resting on her pregnant belly. She thought about the woman she had been 3 years ago. The CEO who believed power and control were the only things that mattered, who had built walls so high that no one could reach her, who measured success in market share and quarterly earnings and feared vulnerability more than failure. That woman would not recognize the life Victoria had now. The smaller apartment they had moved into together that was chaos and mess, and evidence of people actually living instead of maintaining appearances. The job that was meaningful but not all-consuming. The family that was imperfect and complicated and absolutely worth every sacrifice. The Pediatric Cardiology Research Foundation Victoria had established was now funding cutting-edge treatments that might help children like Emma avoid transplant altogether. Horizon Enterprises, under new CEO leadership, was more profitable than ever, while also being more humane, proof that values and success were not mutually exclusive. And Victoria herself had learned to measure wealth not in money or power, but in moments like this, watching her husband's dreams come true, while their daughter thrived and their second daughter grew inside her. It was not the life she had planned. It was better. messier and scarier and infinitely more rewarding than anything she could have designed in a corporate strategy session. Emma appeared at her side again, this time bringing a cup of water. "You need to stay hydrated," she said with the bossy concern of someone who had spent too much time around medical professionals. "And the baby needs you to sit down. Your feet are probably swelling." "Since when did you become the parent?" Victoria asked with amusement. "Since you got too pregnant to boss yourself around," Emma retorted. "Seriously though, go sit. I will bring you a chair." Victoria allowed herself to be settled into a chair Emma commandeered from the gallery office, touched by her daughter's caretaking. Emma sat beside her, both of them watching James handle interviews and collectors with growing confidence. "Do you ever regret it?" Emma asked suddenly. "Giving up being CEO? Changing your whole life for me and Dad?" Victoria looked at her daughter, this brave, brilliant girl, who had faced death and survived, who was thriving now in ways they had hardly dared hope for. "Not for a single second," she said honestly. "You and your dad and your sister," she touched her belly, "you are the best thing I ever built, better than any company or career. You are what success actually looks like." Emma leaned against Victoria's shoulder, a gesture of affection and trust. "I am really glad you decided to be my mom," she said quietly, "even when it was scary and we did not know if I would make it. I am glad you chose us." "I am glad I chose us too," Victoria replied, wrapping her arm around Emma's shoulders. "Best decision I ever made." They sat like that for a while, mother and daughter, watching James charm a group of potential buyers while navigating his first taste of professional success. The gallery was full of their story, frozen in black and white images that captured pain and hope and resilience. It was vulnerability on display, the opposite of everything Victoria had once believed strength should look like. But this was stronger. This messy, complicated love that demanded you show up even when you were terrified. This family built from broken pieces that somehow fit together. This life that had room for both ambition and connection, both achievement and intimacy. James caught Victoria's eye from across the gallery and smiled that same smile that had first caught her attention 3 years ago when he photographed her for the annual report. Back then, she had been ice and armor. Now, she was something infinitely more vulnerable and infinitely more powerful. She was someone who had learned that the real empire worth building was not made of glass and steel and quarterly earnings. It was made of moments like this. A daughter resting against your shoulder. A husband pursuing his dreams. A baby kicking inside you. A family that chose each other and kept choosing each other through every crisis and every triumph. Victoria. Winters had spent 42 years building walls. It took a struggling photographer and his sick daughter to teach her that tearing them down took more courage than constructing them ever did. That love was not weakness, but the bravest thing you could choose. That success without connection was just another form of failure. Emma shifted beside her, then looked up with sudden excitement. "Mom, the baby is kicking. I can feel it." Victoria took Emma's hand and placed it where their daughter was most active. "Feel that? That is your sister saying hello." Emma's face lit up with wonder. "I cannot wait to meet her," she said. "I'm going to teach her everything, how to draw and how to be brave and how lucky she is to have you as a mom, because I know exactly how lucky that is." Victoria felt tears threatening the emotional volatility of late pregnancy, making her more sentimental than usual. But these were good tears. Happy tears. Tears that came from having so much to lose and choosing to love anyway. James materialized beside them, kneeling down to their level. "The gallery owner just made an offer to represent me permanently," he said, disbelief evident in his voice. Actual representation with a contract and everything. Emma threw her arms around his neck. "Daddy, that is amazing. I told you people would love your work. You both told me," James acknowledged, looking between his daughter and his wife. "You both believed in me even when I did not believe in myself. This is as much your victory as mine." "We are a team," Victoria said simply. "Your wins are our wins." Our wins are your wins. That is how family works. They stayed in that gallery until long after the official reception ended, the three of them plus one on the way, celebrating not just James's professional success, but the life they had built together. A life that was not perfect or easy, but was undeniably real. A life worth fighting for. A life worth choosing over and over again, despite the fear and uncertainty. When they finally left, walking out into the cool Manhattan night, Emma between them, holding both their hands, Victoria thought about how far they had all come. From a hospital room where they did not know if Emma would survive to this moment of triumph and joy. From careful distance to chosen family. From fear to love. The city lights glittered around them, the same city where Victoria had once commanded a corporate empire, believing that was all there was to want. Now she commanded nothing and had everything. A husband who understood that strength came in many forms. A daughter who had taught her what courage really meant. Another daughter on the way who would grow up in a family that knew how to hold both joy and sorrow, both success and struggle. This was what Victoria Winters had waited long enough to find. Not a fairy tale, not a perfect happily ever after, but a real, messy, beautiful life built on the radical choice to keep loving even when love meant risking loss. To keep showing up even when showing up meant being vulnerable. To keep building even when you did not know if what you were building would last. Some empires are made of steel and glass. Others are made of moments like this, walking through Manhattan with your family, carrying hope and history and a future that is uncertain but faced together. Victoria had finally learned which kind of empire was worth building, and she was spending the rest of her life constructing it one brave choice at a time.